We are now moving to chapter 14, which is about the non-specific immune system. Right, so the non-specific immune system is sometimes called the innate immune system. Innate because it doesn't need to be pre-programmed. We are born with it as is. The adaptive immune system develops as we age, right, as we mature, but the innate immune system is just there from the start. And it's sometimes called the non-specialized or non-specific immune system because it has the same response to every pathogen no matter what it is. So it's a very generalized response. There's no learning involved. There's no specificity. So we introduced the innate immune system prior. So remember, it's non-specialized, response doesn't vary by pathogen, it's less effective than the adaptive immune system, but it offers an immediate response. And so sometimes when you're sick but with a milder pathogen, the innate immune system can do a lot to prevent progression of disease or even to eliminate a pathogen from the body. And we've already covered the adaptive immune system. So the innate immune system actually is the first line of defense. It's what pathogens encounter when they first enter our bodies. And it like I said, it dampens the disease or staves off infection or reduces progression of the infection until the adaptive immune system has time to mount a more specialized response. The innate immune system involves two lines of defense, first and second. The first line of defense is our physical and chemical barriers. The second line of defense is our innate cellular response. So the physical and chemical barriers are easy to learn. They're intuitive, they make sense, you probably know and understand them already. And then the second line of defense, the cellular response, is going to be the more complicated of the two. It's not going to be as complicated as the adaptive immune system. We'll review a lot of the same concepts that we learned with the adaptive immune system. We're not going to learn about generating immune system memory because that's unique to the adaptive immune system. But a lot of the other concepts that we covered, like cytokines and phagocytosis, things like that, we're just going to repeat again. So you'll get a review of a lot of the material you've already covered. And then the third line of defense is the adaptive immune response. So we started with the third line of defense. Now we're going back to the first and second. So first and second lines of defense are part of the innate or non-specific immune system. Third line of defense is part of the adaptive or specific immune system. All right, so first line of defense, physical and chemical barriers. These are what the pathogen will encounter when they first encounter your body. So your skin, for example, skin and also the linings of your organs. Your organs all have this layer of thick leathery tissue on their surface that prevents wounding, prevents abrasion, prevents infection. So your organ linings also have a protective barrier. It may not be quite as effective as your skin, but it's still somewhat effective. And then you have your body fluids. Often the purpose of your body fluids is actually to prevent disease. Sometimes they're dual purpose, but often a large part of their purpose is to get rid of, expel pathogens. And then you have things that act as filters, like hairs in your various orifices, right? So like your nose hairs, ear hairs, things like that. So those act as filters to prevent so many pathogens from entering. All right, so skin, it's really hard to penetrate. We kind of covered this in chapter 13 on microbial mechanisms of pathogenicity. So our skin is keratinized, meaning it has this really hard protein in the cells, in the skin cells. So most of your skin cells are actually dead cells. So when they first start as stem cells, when they divide, they start generating this hydrophobic, hard, durable protein called keratin. And then as the cells on the bottom of your skin divide more and more, they push up the older cells towards the surface and they get squished and they die, and eventually they're just dead sacs of compressed keratin. And that's what most of your skin is. So it's always getting sloughed off. You can get an abrasion and you don't bleed. You've got all these thick, dead layers of keratinized skin. You also have oil glands across all of your skin. The oils that are excreted by your oil glands inhibit microbial growth as well. They also fortify the skin by keeping it moist so it doesn't dry and flake off dandruffy. So it fortifies the skin, makes it more durable, but the skin oils are really acidic. They have a pH of 3 to 5. So that inhibits microbial growth. And your sweat also can prevent microbial growth. It has lysozyme, which we've covered before. Lysozyme is one of the many antimicrobials that your body can make. So the way we'll talk, there's lots of antimicrobial peptides, we call them, little tiny proteins that have antimicrobial action that various cells in your body can produce. We talk most about lysozyme because it's really found everywhere, and what it does is it degrades cell walls. So lysozyme is in your sweat. The oils that your skin produces are acidic. All of those things help prevent, and then you have that hard keratin in your skin layer. All of those things prevent microbes from getting through your skin or infecting your skin. Then you have your lacrimal apparatus. That's your tear ducts. Your tears flush microbes out of your eyes, and they also have antimicrobial properties. Lysozyme, among other antimicrobials, are in your tears because your eyes are really vulnerable to infection. And so that's why one of the many, you also don't want them to dry out, of course, but the other purpose of the constant washing is to prevent microbial infection. And then hairs, like I said, act as filters to trap microbes. So when you breathe in through your nose, a lot of debris, not just microbes, but other kinds of debris also, gets stuck in your nose hairs and don't go into your respiratory tract because of that. And then when you exhale, you can blow them back out. All right, so chemical barriers. So the skin is the most obvious physical barrier. A lot of these are a combination of physical and chemical barriers. So saliva would probably be more chemical, right? So it traps and washes away microbes. It's really sticky, so microbes get stuck in it. And then you usually end up swallowing it into your stomach, and then the microbes are exposed to that really strong stomach acid where they're destroyed, or you can cough them and sneeze them out. And your saliva also has antibacterial properties. Your saliva has a lot of antibodies in it, so your white blood cells actually excrete antibodies into your mucous membranes in various parts of your your GI tract, your digestional tract, your GI tract, and also your respiratory tract. So all that mucus in your respiratory tract and GI tract has antibodies that help fight infection, but also things like lysozyme and other antimicrobial peptides are there. Earwax is really sticky and acidic and traps microbes to prevent them from giving you ear infections. Urine flushes microbes all the time, and your urine also has lysozyme in it. And then vaginal secretions. So we've talked about vaginal secretions in class before. We've talked about how the vaginal environment is really, really acidic. It's not the vaginal secretions themselves that are acidic, but vaginal secretions have food for lactobacilli, and lactobacilli ferment and create lactic acid, which is acidic. And it's that acidity created by the lactobacilli. So the glycogen is it's a starch found in vaginal secretions. Lactobacilli eat the glycogen. It's like a starch, I should say. So it's this long chains of sugars. Lactobacilli really like to ferment that glycogen. They use lactic acid fermentation. And that creates a really acidic environment that lactobacilli enjoy, but other bacteria that could be pathogenic do not. So that keeps the vaginal microbiome safe. Not only that, but those vaginal secretions trap and flush microbes. So instead of moving up, they move out. Because the vaginal environment, it's dark, it's warm, it's wet, so you can imagine that without the help of those lactobacilli, that's a perfect place for pathogens to take hold. So that whole thing with lactobacilli, we also talked about how they generate hydrogen peroxide, which is a reactive oxygen species. Lactobacilli are highly resilient to reactive oxygen species, but other microbes tend not to be so resilient. And so not only are they creating a really acidic environment that human pathogens, which are neutrophiles, don't like, but they're also creating a lot of hydrogen peroxide, which especially the more anaerobic bacteria do not like. So that process of lactobacilli creating an environment that's good for itself but bad for other bacteria, we call that microbial antagonism. Microbial antagonism, that's when microbes antagonize each other, right? And so our good microbes in our microbiome do a lot of things to antagonize other pathogens, other microbes that we wouldn't want in our bodies. And they do that by excreting compounds that fight off other bacteria like acids and hydrogen peroxide or even antibiotics. They can do that by just taking up all the space, all the food, so that there's nowhere for a pathogen to take hold. And I'm introducing this concept of microbial antagonism now because our microbiome is actually a piece of our primary defense, our innate immune response to pathogens. So I'm not going to talk about the microbiome a lot right now because we have a whole chapter on it coming up next, but I want to introduce it a little bit now because we understand now that our microbes, we have microbes living on our skin, we have microbes living in the vaginal environment, in our lungs, so in our respiratory tract, pretty much everywhere, in our guts. And these microbes are actually really essential to helping us fight off infection. And so, germ-free rats that never developed a microbiome, they are far more prone to infection once they leave their germ-free bubbles versus rats that have a microbiome. And we'll talk a lot about that next class, but I'm going to introduce it here. So microbial antagonism, that is how microbes fight each other, and it's also how our good microbes fight off bad microbes. All right, back to physical and chemical barriers. So mucous membranes in general. So mucous membranes include membranes. You especially find mucous membranes where gas or nutrient exchange takes place. So in your lungs, you have these really, really like thinner than paper thin tissues where oxygen and carbon dioxide are supposed to exchange across the surface of these tissues. So for that gas exchange to happen well, you need the tissues to be incredibly thin. And the same thing in your gastrointestinal tract. You have these really, really thin membranes that allow nutrients to be exchanged across, in your intestines so that you can bring nutrients out of your food. So because those membranes are so thin, they'd be highly prone to abrasion and to drying out. And so there tend to be a lot of cells included that create mucus to protect those really thin tissues. So that's usually where you find mucous membranes, where there's going to be gas or nutrient exchange. And because those membranes are so thin, they're also really vulnerable to infection. So the mucous membranes trap and flush microbes, they excrete antimicrobial chemicals, and they have a lot of antibodies excreted into the mucus. And so, like I said, gastrointestinal tract, respiratory tract, also genitourinary tract as well. So, and then vomit and diarrhea. This is a way for you to expel pathogens. Now, this is sort of there's a little bit of conflict between what's good for you and what's good for society when it comes to vomiting and diarrhea, because you are expelling the microbes out of your body when you puke or when you have diarrhea, and that's good for you. But vomit and diarrhea is also a way, they're also vehicles that pathogens use to get from one human being to the next. So these liquids also carry disease, right? These bodily excretions also carry disease to the next individual, and that helps the pathogen can capitalize upon those bodily excretions to traverse through, to move through a society. So while vomit and diarrhea is actually good for you, as long as you can stay hydrated, it's good for you to help get rid of a microbe, but it's bad for the community because it spreads the microbe to others. Okay, so that is pretty simple, right? You have these bodily excretions. Every single bodily excretion has an antimicrobial function. You have physical barriers that prevent microbes from entering, sort of like castle walls. So that piece is fairly intuitive, but then you have the cellular response, and that's going to be a bit more complicated. So before we go into the cellular response, I'm going to set this up the way I did with the adaptive immune system, and we'll start with vocabulary in the next lecture video.